Alright, so the book we are going to read today is the title is Real Ghost Stories by Brad Steiger. Okay, let's read this part. Real ghosts, restless eldest child, Jane, was moved to another room, but her relocation did not spare her the torment of having her bed levitated. The phenomenon had begun to leave its domain on the upper floor, venturing to the lower floors during the night. The kitchen seemed to be a favorite target for its nightly forays, and on several mornings the cook would find the kitchen chairs heaped in a disorderly pile, the shutters thrown open, and utensils scattered about the room. Mrs. Proctor's brother, Jonathan Carr, spent a night filled with so much commotion that he declared he would not stay in the house for any amount of money. Jane, Mrs. Proctor's sister, was much more strong-nerved than her brother, judging from the journal that Joseph Proctor kept. The young woman spent many evenings in the afflicted house. One night, as she shared a room with Mary Young, the cook, the two women were terrified to hear the bolt in their door slide back, the handle turn, and the doors open. As an invisible entity moved across the bed the women shared, the bed curtains began to rustle, and the bed covers were suddenly lifted and thrown off the bed, revealing the two trembling figures. Both the women saw a distinctly dark shadow against the curtains that hung from the bed frame. Little Jane Proctor was sleeping with her Aunt Jane one night when she saw a strange head peeping out at her from the bed curtains. The 4-year-old girl later described the head as being that of an old woman, but she became much too frightened to continue her observation and tucked her own head under the covers. Joseph Jr. was disturbed nearly every night by some facet or other of the phenomena. He reported hearing the words "never mind" and "come get it" being repeated over and over without any apparent meaningful application. As he attempted to sleep, he constantly heard footsteps shuffling around his bed, and he both heard and felt forceful thumps to his pillow and other bedclothes. A medical doctor named Drury arrived and asked Proctor's permission to carry out an examination of the haunted upper room. Proctor consented and allowed the doctor and his companion, a young chemist, to make preparations to spend a night in the disturbed room. At about 1 a.m., Proctor was awakened by a piercing scream of terror coming from the upper floor. Drury had come face to face with the ghost of the wizened old woman. The two curious would-be investigators spent the rest of the night drinking coffee in the kitchen. They left the house at dawn. Proctor noted in his journal that the doctor and the chemist had received a shock that they would not soon forget. One of the most incredible materializations in Rillington Mill was that of an entity resembling a monkey. One day, 8-year-old Joseph Jr. was seated atop a chest of drawers, pretending that he was making a speech to his sister Jane and his brothers Henry and Edmund, when his presentation was rudely interrupted. Suddenly, in full view of all the children, a monkey-like creature appeared and began to tug at Joseph's shoe strap. By the time Joseph Sr. came running in response to the other excited cries, the children were scurrying about the floor, trying desperately to play with the mischievous monkey. 2-year-old Edmund, the youngest Proctor child, continued to look under chairs and tables until his bedtime, trying to locate the entity that he identified as a funny-looking cat. Years later, the memory of that incident was still vivid in Edmund Proctor's mind. In the December 1892 issue of the Journal of the Society for Psychical Research, he wrote, "Now it so happens that this monkey is the first incident in the lugubrious hauntings, or whatever they may be termed, of which I have any recollection. I suppose it was, or might easily be, the first monkey that I had ever seen, which may explain my memory being so impressed that I have not forgotten it. My parents have told me that no monkey was known to be owned in the neighborhood, and that after diligent inquiry no organ man or hurdy-gurdy boy, either with or without a monkey, had been seen anywhere about the place or neighborhood, either on that day or for a length of time. I have an absolutely distinct recollection of that monkey and of running to it to see it where it went to as it hopped out of the room and into the adjoining room. We sought to go under the bed in that room, but it could not be traced or found anywhere afterwards. We hunted and ferreted about that room and every corner of the house, but no monkey or any trace of one was more to be found. Aunt Jane Carr did not see the monkeys, but she reported that she had heard what sounded like an animal jumping off an easy chair. The white face of what appeared to be an old woman was seen more and more often, but Joseph Jr. soon added an old man to the list of materializations. One of the more astonishing visual materializations also occurred to the younger Joseph. The haunting force fashioned a double of the young boy. Imagine the boy's shock upon discovering his mirror image peeking at him from the shadows beside his bed. He was about 10 years old when this facet of the phenomenon manifested, so his powers of observation must be given some credence. Joseph Jr. said that his spectral self-image, which was even dressed in a manner identical to his, walked back and forth between the window and the wardrobe before it gradually dematerialized. Shortly after this dramatic episode, the Proctors decided that they had endured enough. Patient Quakers, though they were, 11 years of living amidst incessant supernatural disturbances had been enough for them. They had also become fearful that the plague-ridden dwelling would inflict permanent injury to the minds of their children. In 1866, Proctor obtained a residence at Camp Villa, North Shields, and after completing the arduous task of packing their belongings, he and his wife sent the servants and the children on ahead to their new residence. Mr. and Mrs. Proctor stayed behind alone to properly close up the house. Their final night in Willington Mill was perhaps the most frightening of all. The constant sound of heavy thuds prevented them from getting any rest at all. The house echoed with the sound of boxes being dragged down the stairs, but the house was empty save for them. All of their boxes had been moved out earlier that day, yet they continued to hear footsteps walking across the floors, dragging invisible furniture. The Proctors were, in effect, hearing a ghostly reenactment of all the noises made by the family and their servants as they were engaged in their various moving chores. The Proctors wondered with some panic if the ghosts were packing in order to move with them to the new house. It was with indescribable relief that the Proctors arrived at the new residence to find it completely free of the former horror that had blemished 11 years of their lives. Their residency in the new home was blissfully untroubled by knockings, whistlings, footsteps, and phantasms. After the Proctors moved from Willington Mill, the house was divided into 2 apartments. According to later testimonies of the new occupants, only the occasional haunting phenomena occurred. However, in approximately 1868, when 2 new families moved into the apartments, they were so greatly disturbed by ghostly manifestations that one family moved out and refused to return. After a number of years had passed, the mill was closed and made into a warehouse, and the old Proctor house was divided into a number of small tenements. When Edmund Proctor visited the place around 1890, none of the tenants claimed to be troubled by ghosts. It appeared that whatever ethereal beings had plagued the house at Willington Mill had moved on. Next part of the chapter is the dancing ghosts of Orensburg. On November 16th, 1870, when he returned to his large country estate near Orensburg in the Russian province of Urals, a wealthy landowner named Shapov found his household in an uproar over a dancing ghost. According to Helena, his 20-year-old wife, their baby daughter had been fussy on the night of the 14th and had not been at all eager to go to sleep. Mrs. Shapov asked Maria, the cook, if she would see to the child. Maria entertained the girl with her harmonica, while her mistress and the local miller's wife gossiped in the living room. When Mrs. Shapov heard the sounds of the cook's feet tapping the floor in a brisk 3-step dance, she remarked that when all else failed, Maria danced for the child, which always put the little one to sleep. The miller's wife was in the act of nodding her head in agreement when she suddenly opened her mouth in both surprise and terror and screamed that there was someone looking in the window. Mrs. Shapov turned and saw nothing to cause the woman so much alarm. The miller's wife was visibly shaken and disturbed and said that she thought that she had seen a horrid face looking in at them. Mrs. Shapov assured her that it was probably only a shadow of some sort. The awkward moment was interrupted as Maria entered the room and told her mistress that her child was now sound asleep. Mrs. Shapov thanked the cook and dismissed her for the evening. A few minutes later, as the 2 women sat chatting, the miller's wife once again claimed that she saw something at the window. Mrs. Shapov rose from her chair to investigate, but she was halted in her journey to the window by the sound of an uproar in the attic above their heads. At first, it seemed to be a flurry of wild rappings that had the 2 women staring at one another in wide-eyed confusion. Then the pace of the sound slowed until they began to sound like the 3-step Maria had been dancing for the child. Mrs. Shapov was perplexed. What was that silly woman doing up in the attic? Did she never get her fill of dancing? The miller's wife questioned how the cook could have gotten up to the attic without their seeing her pass. Without speaking another word, the 2 women left the sitting room and walked quietly back to the cook's quarters. Opening the door just a crack, they were able to see Maria sound asleep in her bed. Determined to see who had gone up to the loft unnoticed, Mrs. Shophoff grabbed a lantern from a kitchen shelf, and the two women walked up the stairs to the attic. Although the sounds of the dancing continued, their lantern plainly revealed that there was no one left in the loft. Then, as the women beat a hasty retreat down the stairs, the tapping seemed to race ahead of them, rattling the windows and pounding at the walls. The miller's wife fled the manor to get her husband, and the gardener and Mrs. Shophoff went to the nursery. That didn't make any sense. Let me read that again. The miller's wife fled the manor to get her husband, and the gardener and Mrs. Shophoff went to the nursery to check on the welfare of her daughter. Okay. By the time the miller's wife returned with her husband and the gardener, the rappings and dancing had attained such a volume that both Mrs. Shophoff's mother and mother-in-law, as well as Maria, had been awakened by the racket. The two men searched the house and the grounds and found nothing that could explain the bizarre disturbance, which continued until dawn. At 10 p.m. the next evening, the dancing ghost once again began its spirited interpretation of the three-step. The Shophoff servants patrolled the house and the grounds, but could find no trace of the invisible dancer, who continued to perform and to evade the searchers until dawn. When Mr. Shophoff returned that next afternoon from his business trip, he scoffed at his young wife's account and jokingly accused her of getting into his brandy while he had been away. Shophoff was a no-nonsense landowner who had little patience with superstitious folk tales and accounts of ghosts, dancing or otherwise. He grew very impatient when his mother and mother-in-law warned him that something supernatural had visited the house in his absence, substantiating Helena's story of a dancing ghost. Let's see where we at. Here it is. In a gruff and irritated manner, Shophoff scolded the ladies for having sat around idly in the evenings concocting a ghost story that had frightened the servants and distracted them from their work. He sent Maria to fetch the miller, a man he regarded as completely sensible and reliable, to set the matter straight. The miller didn't disappoint him. While he admitted that there had been strange noises that had disturbed and confused the entire household, he stated that he had that very day removed a pigeon's nest from under a cornice of the house. It seemed likely to him that the bird had somehow been responsible for the weird noises that had so upset the women and the servants. Shophoff knew that he could count on the miller to put an end to wild tales of a dancing ghost. That evening, after the rest of the household had retired to their rooms quite early, exhausted from their nocturnal ordeals of chasing the eerie tapping sounds, Shophoff sat down on a chair in the study to read for a while before going to bed. At about 10 o'clock, he was distracted by scratching noises from above his head. Thinking at first that the pesky pigeon had come back to roost under the cornice, he became puzzled when he listened more closely to the sounds. He soon realized the sounds were not those of an animal, rather it sounded as though someone in the room above him was dancing a three-step. Believing that Helena was having a bit of fun with him, Shophoff put down his book and began climbing quietly up the stairs to his wife's room. He stood outside the door for a moment to be certain that he had accurately traced the sound of the dancing. Then, convinced that there was no doubt that the sounds were coming from Helena's room, he pushed open the door and stood ready to deliver a stern lecture to his young wife. She lay in her bed, her eyelids closed in deep sleep. The sounds of dancing had ceased the moment that he had opened the door. There was something strange going on here. Confused and more than a little baffled, Shophoff started to close the door when a series of rappings sounded from above his wife's bed. He walked quietly to the wall, thinking he might catch a hidden prankster in the act of hammering on the bedstead. Just as he bent to listen more carefully to the noises, a rap sounded with such force next to his ear that it nearly deafened him. His wife sat up in bed, screaming in shock and fear. She calmed when she saw her husband standing near her bedside. "What was that?" she demanded. "Did you hear it?" Not wishing to alarm his wife, Shophoff insisted that he had heard nothing, as if to call him a liar. Two explosive knocks seemed to shake the house down to its very foundation. The angry landowner took his pistol from a drawer, slipped on his coat, and declared that he was putting a stop to the nonsense. He got his dogs, roused the servants, and told them that they were going to find out who was responsible for the outrage against his home. However, Shophoff found no prankster that night on whom he might vent his spleen. To those on the outside of the house, the rapping seemed to come from the inside, but those who remained indoors shouted that someone was trying to batter the house down from the outside. At last, Shapov had to admit defeat, and he dismissed his men for the night. The next day, he enlisted the help of his troubled neighbors as well as his own servants. The crew searched the entire house and examined every foot of the grounds. That night, at Shapov's request, his neighbors stayed to witness the disturbances. The uninvited invisible guests performed well. It danced above the heads of the searchers all night long, and for a finale, it struck a door with such force that the heavy wooden planking was torn from the hinges. By the next night, even the stubborn landowner had become a believer in the dancing ghost, and it was obvious that he dreaded the onset of a new round of the phenomena. He paced the floor nervously until 10 o'clock, the time the manifestations usually began, but on this night there was not a single scratching, rapping, or sprightly dance three-step. Nor was there any sound from the loft on the next night. It appeared that the mysterious phenomena had quieted down in the Shapov country house, or perhaps they might have if the Shapovs would have left well enough alone. A month later, on December 20th, the Shapovs were entertaining guests who openly expressed their skepticism of the phenomena their host described as having been active in the house. Angered that their guests would doubt his word, Shapov summoned Maria to the parlor and commanded her to perform a three-step, announcing in a loud voice that probably all the ghost needed was a little coaxing and it would come back. At her master's insistence, Maria danced a brisk little three-step. The cook completed the dance, then looked around the room tearfully as a tapping began at the windows. The assembled guests listened incredulously as they heard an exact replication of Maria's dance coming from the attic overhead. The skeptical guests accused Shapov of having planted another servant up in the loft, but when a group of doubters went up into the attic to investigate, they found no one. On New Year's Eve, 1871, Shapov again ordered Maria to dance a three-step in order to induce the dancing ghost to follow her with an act of its own. The country home was filled with guests who heard for themselves the ghostly echo of Maria's dance coming from the ceiling above their heads. The invisible performer became so animated and enthusiastic that for the first time it made some attempts at vocalization and sang some garbled snatches of Russian folk songs. After such remarkable phenomena had been produced at 2 holiday parties, the stories about the mysterious goings-on at Shapov's country place spread across Russia. Soon, scientists and spiritualists sought an audience with the dancing ghost, using widely diverse methods of communicating with the strange force. An investigator by the name of Dr. Shostov explained the whole phenomena by invoking the magic name of electricity. He maintained that the soil conditions at the country place had produced the weird phenomena. He also theorized that somehow the electrical vibrations might be coming from Mrs. Shapov. Dr. Shostov's theory of prankish electrical currents was doomed when the phenomena began to give evidence of increasingly advancing intelligence that could respond to conversation and questions advanced by investigators. A psychic investigator named Alexeyev advised a series of knocks that he claimed allowed him to communicate with the entity haunting the country estate. According to information gathered by Alexeyev, Mr. Shapov had been cursed by the servant of a neighboring miller. For whatever reason, this angry servant so despised Shapov that he had meticulously set a devil on the wealthy landowner. The provincial governor General Burvikin appointed a group of individuals to be official investigators of the disturbances that plagued the Shapov estate. The team included Mr. Akutin, an engineer, the aforementioned Dr. Shostov, an electrical theorist, and Mr. Savichev, a magazine editor. This committee eventually decided that Mrs. Shapov had been producing the so-called supernatural effects by means of trickery, and Mr. Shapov received a sharply worded letter from the governor warning him not to allow his wife to produce the phenomena again. In spite of the governor's demands, the violence of the disturbances at the Shapov estate continued to increase. The ghost had acquired incendiary abilities, and Helena Shapov was the one who bore the brunt of the attacks. Balls of fire circled the house and bounced against the windows of her room as if seeking to smash into the house and set it aflame. Dresses that hung unattended in closets burst into flames. Once a mattress began burning underneath a guest as he readied himself for bed. The ghastly climax of the haunting phenomena occurred when Mrs. Shapoff appeared to become a veritable pillar of fire in front of the horrified eyes of the miller and another house guest. A crackling noise had come from beneath the floor, followed by a long, high-pitched wailing. A bluish spark seemed to jump up at Mrs. Shapoff, and her thin dress was instantly swathed in flames. She cried out in terror and collapsed into unconsciousness. The house guest leapt to his feet and valiantly beat the flames out with his bare hands. The most curious thing about the incident was that the courageous guest suffered severe burns, while Mrs. Shapoff received not a single blister, even though her dress was nearly completely consumed by the flames. The Shapoffs had had enough of their encounters with the dancing ghost. When the entity had connected itself with the nightly performance of the three-step, it had merely been a noisy nuisance. Now it had become a vicious terror quite capable of dealing out fiery destruction. Mr. Shapoff closed up his country place and made arrangements for a permanent move to the city of Eletsky. The phenomena ceased at once after the Shapoffs had taken up residence in their own place. Although Helena Shapoff recovered the health that had been rapidly waning under the onslaughts of the ghosts, she died in childbirth 8 years after their move. The Orensburg haunting is an unusual case in many ways. Perhaps, as some have theorized, there actually was a curse levied on Mr. Shapoff by a disgruntled servant of a neighboring miller. The projected hatred of such an individual may somehow have intensified what had begun as a rather ordinary haunting phenomena, e.g., the face at the window, the imitation of the cooks dancing, the raps on the walls, and transformed them into a force of malicious evil. Eerie footsteps in the attic. Okay, we're going to read this last section of this chapter, and then we'll continue on another time. The townhouse that Karen and her husband bought in July 1992 was only 11 years old and in good condition. Shortly after they moved in, she began hearing someone walking in the upstairs hallway. At first she thought it was her own sneaking out of bed, which sometimes it was, but other times when she went to investigate, he was in bed asleep. Karen never said anything about the footsteps to her husband, making the assumption that the sounds were the result of the house settling on her imagination. Okay, let's see yours. Okay. So is this the name of the chapter? Okay, so this part is called The Personal Experience of Karen. My husband is disabled, so he is home all day. Soon he began telling me that he kept hearing someone walking upstairs when nobody else was home but him. He said that he heard the sounds frequently, so I told him that I was also hearing things at night. Then our 4-year-old son started telling us about the mice that were in his room at night. I went into his room and lay down with him one night. I heard so many scratchy noises on the floor and sounds like children running around the room that I scooped him up and got out of there. I put him in bed with us, and then we heard the walking sound in the hallway. The next night, while my husband and I were in bed, we heard someone walking in our bedroom. The sound started on my side of the bed, moved around the bed, then went out of the room, down the hallway, and down the stairs. One night, my son came running out of his room into our bedroom, wide-eyed and out of breath, and said that there was a big dog in his room, and he wouldn't go back in there. He was awake until almost dawn before he fell asleep again. In the first month after we moved into the townhouse, we went through at least 100 light bulbs. We couldn't keep them burning. The ceiling fixtures in the bathroom, hallway, and kitchen lights blew out constantly and within hours of each other. My brain is faster than I can read out loud. The previous owners had left several boxes and an old lead mirror in a plain wooden frame in the attic. I brought the mirror down from the attic and decided to hang it out at the end of the hallway opposite our son's bedroom door. There weren't any noises until after I hung it, and most of the noises were in that hallway or our bedrooms off of that hallway. My mother told me to get rid of the mirror, and the noises stopped after I carried it out and set it with the trash. So maybe for my second video for the week, I'll just do some reading, since some people seem to like that. And the next section in this chapter will be called Ghostly Wrappings in a Mobile Home. Okay, bye.